On my 70th birthday, my daughter-in-law gave her mother a diamond ring worth $19,000 and a luxury trip to Italy. I got a $7 plastic bracelet. I sat there, smiling like a fool, while the applause rang out for someone else's mother. That night, I found out they had turned my voice into content for a podcast that made them money. What do you do when love becomes a business plan? And what happens when a mother decides to close her account? I turned 70 on a quiet Saturday in May. The sun was out, and everything smelled like blooming lilacs. Fallon said they were throwing me a simple, heartfelt birthday lunch at their house. I should have known better. Their home in Linden was anything but simple. The long driveway was lined with rented SUVs and floral arches. Music played from hidden speakers. The guest list included Fallon's yoga clients, her podcast followers, even a local journalist from Burlington. But somehow, I was the one who felt out of place. Fallon floated around in a linen dress, champagne in hand, while Ellis trailed behind her carrying trays of canapes. They barely made eye contact with me. When I walked in, Fallon gave me a quick air kiss and whispered that my seat was over by the herb wall, where the lighting was good for pictures. I didn't even have time to process what that meant before I was ushered into a corner. Then came the moment that turned the day. Fallon stood up and tapped a spoon against her glass. Everyone quieted down. She looked over at her mother, Celeste, sitting across from me in a silk scarf and designer sandals. "Mum," Fallon said, her voice thick with emotion, "I wouldn't be who I am without you." Ellis appeared beside her, holding a red velvet box. Fallon opened it and pulled out a diamond ring that caught every ray of sunlight in the yard. $19,000 at least. I didn't need to guess. Fallon had mentioned once on her podcast that she had been saving up for a legacy gift. I thought it was for me. "There's more," she added, reaching into a second envelope. 2 first-class tickets to Tuscany. 9 days. Wine tastings, spa days, guided history tours. People clapped. Celeste actually cried. I sat very still, my hands folded, my back straight. I tried to swallow the lump forming in my throat. "And now," Fallon said lightly, "we didn't forget about you, Lenora." She walked over and placed a small paper bag in my lap. I pulled out a plastic bracelet. Pink, stretchy, with a charm shaped like a cupcake. It looked like something from the party favor aisle. There was a card inside. Printed words said "Happy Birthday." No message, no signature. I smiled. I nodded. I thanked her in a voice that didn't sound like mine. No one noticed. The music resumed. People returned to their wine and fruit tarts. Fallon wrapped her arms around Celeste again and posed for more photos. I spent the rest of the party pretending to enjoy my salad, while guests walked past me to compliment Fallon on how thoughtful and radiant she was. I didn't even finish the cupcake that came with my name on it. Something about it tasted bitter. If you've ever celebrated your own birthday and still felt invisible, I know what that feels like. Leave a comment with your age or the last time someone made you feel forgotten. Maybe I'm not the only one. Maybe we've all been sitting in someone else's story, waiting to be seen. The house felt colder than usual when I walked in, though the thermostat read 72. I slipped off my shoes and set the bracelet down on the counter beside my keys. It looked even cheaper under the kitchen light. The pink plastic faded, the charm already scuffed. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't want noise. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floor settling. It was the kind of quiet that used to comfort me. After my husband Warren passed, silence became a familiar companion. It wrapped around me like a heavy quilt. Some nights, I even welcomed it. But that night, it pressed too close. I sat at the small table in the breakfast nook, fingers tapping the wood. I thought about that cupcake charm. How many years had I baked birthday cakes from scratch, with little notes tucked inside for Ellis? How many times had I planned and paid for his parties, his graduation, his wedding? The bracelet was like a joke I didn't understand, and Fallon had delivered it with that bright, breezy voice she used when she didn't care how it landed. My mind wandered further back, to when Fallon first entered our lives. She was 22, recently graduated from a small liberal arts college, with a minor in social work and a yoga certification she was very proud of. She met Ellis at a wellness seminar he attended on a whim. 2 months later, she was having brunch at our house and calling me Ms. Keane. I tried. I really did. I welcomed her with the same warmth I would have offered any daughter. I made space for her at the table and in the photo frames. When she got sick her first winter in Vermont, I dropped off soup and cold medicine without being asked. She once told me I had a calm presence. Back then, I thought that meant she saw me. It wasn't perfect, of course. Fallon had a way of rearranging rooms, both literally and socially. She talked over me at dinners. She corrected Ellis in front of guests. She spoke in hashtags before hashtags were common. But I told myself she was young, full of ideas, trying to prove herself. I gave her the benefit of every doubt. And when they got married, I didn't just give a blessing. I gave money, a lot of it. $42,000 to help them with the venue and catering, the dress, the photographer. I told them it was a gift, not a loan, because I believed that generosity, when it came from love, didn't need receipts. Warren had his concerns. He saw through people faster than I did. One night he told me Fallon didn't look at Ellis the way a woman should look at her husband. He said she looked at him like he was a stepping stone. I told him not to be cynical, that Fallon just had ambition. And Warren, kind as he was, let the matter rest. He died 3 years later, and part of me was glad he hadn't lived to see how right he had been. I looked at the bracelet again. Plastic, hollow, pretty on the surface, but made to snap under pressure. Maybe that was the perfect gift, after all. A thing that couldn't carry weight. A thing that wasn't meant to last. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat with that thought for a long time. Not angry, not even sad. Just tired. Tired of mistaking politeness for love. Tired of shrinking to fit someone else's idea of family. The silence didn't comfort me anymore. It only reminded me what had slowly faded from my life. Warmth, respect, and the smallest effort to see me as a person. 3 days after the party, I got a phone call from Darlene Stewart, an old friend from my early years in the Community Health Board. We hadn't spoken in over 6 months. I answered, thinking maybe she needed help with one of her programs. Instead, her voice sounded hesitant. She said she had been listening to a podcast that had been making the rounds among some women's circles. It was hosted by a woman named Fallon, who described her as a survivor of emotional control and generational silence. Darlene didn't know Fallon was my daughter-in-law until midway through the 2nd episode, but once she did, she felt I should know. I didn't understand what she meant at first. Fallon had started a wellness podcast a year earlier. I had even listened to a few episodes when it first launched. Back then, she talked about meditation and time blocking and composting. There was nothing controversial. But Darlene said the latest episodes were different. She said Fallon had changed her format into something more personal, more confessional. After we hung up, I opened my laptop and searched the title Darlene mentioned. Rooted Women. It wasn't hard to find. The banner showed Fallon sitting cross-legged on a blanket in front of a field of lavender. Her hair pulled back in a soft bun, eyes closed, smiling as if she were immune to pain. I clicked on the first of the 3 newest episodes. They were titled with vague phrases like healing from invisible harm and the weight of unspoken rules. I listened in silence, and then I heard my own voice. It was a clipped sentence, taken from a family dinner last spring when Ellis had tested a new recording mic Fallon had gifted him. I remembered that evening because I had mentioned Warren's old camera and how it still worked better than Ellis's new one. I had said, plainly, that not everything old should be replaced just because it looked worn. A harmless comment. But in the podcast, it was stripped of context and played right after Fallon described a woman who constantly belittled her. I kept listening. Fallon told stories of a mother figure who made her feel judged and small. She talked about having to smile through backhanded compliments and stifled independence. Each story was framed vaguely enough to avoid legal trouble, but specific enough that anyone who knew our family would understand. The second episode included audio clips. My laugh, my voice correcting Ellis about a recipe, my advice on refinancing their mortgage, made to sound like manipulation. I closed the laptop. My hands trembled. Not with rage, but with something harder to name. Something like betrayal that had been aged in silence until it became disbelief. It was never about the bracelet. Not really, that was just the symbol. The podcast was the actual blow, the twist of the knife. Fallon hadn't just forgotten me. She had reimagined me, painted me in grayscale so she could shine in colour. I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. The plastic charm from the bracelet still sat near the sink. I looked at it now as a stamp, marking where I stood in her version of the story. Decorative, hollow, convenient. And then I wondered how many others had listened. How many had nodded along as she spoke, picturing a bitter old woman who needed to be escaped from. I thought of Ellis. He had never mentioned the podcast. Not once. He had let it spread while I stood in the background of my own life, unaware that someone else was narrating it for me. It was no longer about what I had received or didn't receive. It was about what had been taken. My words, my image, my side of the story, without my knowledge, without my consent, and worst of all, without the slightest trace of regret. I didn't sleep that night. My body went through the motions of rest, but my mind moved like a machine that wouldn't power down. Around 4 in the morning, I got up, made tea, and sat at the kitchen table in my robe. I stared at the cabinet across from me, the bottom drawer on the left. That was where I kept all my old financial records. I hadn't opened it in years. Warren used to tease me about how obsessively I documented everything. I told him I liked the comfort of paper trails. Back then, I didn't know one day I'd be using them to count the cost of my own love. I pulled the drawer open and ran my fingers across the neatly labelled folders. They were sorted by name. Fallon, Ellis, wedding, medical, vehicles, business support. I started with Fallon's folder. The tuition receipts came first, University of Vermont, 2 semesters of bridge courses so she could meet her licensure requirements. I paid directly to the registrar, just over $14,000. Then came the check I wrote when she didn't get the scholarship she was counting on. That one was $28,000. Tuition, books, housing, all of it covered, $42,000 in total. I remember writing that last check. I told her it wasn't a loan, just a show of faith in her future. Next came the smoothie shop, Fallon's first business venture. She had a dream of combining nutrition and community. I believed in that dream. I co-signed on the lease, paid for equipment when the startup loan fell short, covered payroll for 2 months when sales were slow. $65,000. She closed the shop after 10 months. She said it was a learning experience. Then I moved to the IVF receipts. I hadn't looked at those in years. 3 failed cycles, travel expenses to Boston for the specialist, medication not covered by insurance, 36,000 and some change. I remember the phone call the day she found out she was pregnant. She cried. I cried too. It felt like something sacred had been fulfilled. I didn't think once about the cost. Then the vehicle. A black SUV with leather seats and a built-in navigation system. It was a birthday gift, $38,000. Ellis wanted to lease something cheaper, but Fallon said she needed something safer for the baby. I wired the down payment and co-signed the loan. Then the part that made me pause. A folder labeled emergency. Inside was a copy of a bank transfer I made 3 years ago, $14,500. I remembered now. Fallon had come over in tears, said someone had opened a credit card in her name. She felt violated, unsafe. I offered to help. I never asked for details. I paid it off the same day. I never knew until now that the card had been opened using my name as co-signer. Last, I opened the folder labeled Home. 70,000. That's what I contributed toward the down payment on the house they live in now. Fallon said it would make all the difference for them to start in the right neighborhood. I never once set foot in that house without calling ahead. When I finished tallying the totals, I sat back in the chair. $265,000. Every dollar I gave with an open hand. And yet none of it protected me from being cast as the villain in a story I didn't know was being written. What struck me wasn't the money itself. I could earn it. I had. What cut deepest was how my silence had become a blank check. Every time I held my tongue, they assumed I agreed. Every time I stayed out of their way, they interpreted it as weakness. I closed the drawer. The paper trail was clean, no drama, no fingerprints, just numbers. But they said everything. They said I had been more than generous. They said I had given everything I could. And still, somehow, I had ended up with the blame. By the following Monday, I had listened to all 3 podcast episodes twice, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to understand exactly how I had been rewritten. Fallon had created a story that didn't just exclude me, it replaced me. She spoke with a calm, deliberate voice, paused between thoughts, let silence fill the gaps, like she was offering the listener space to breathe. I could almost admire the technique, if it hadn't been so thoroughly laced with betrayal. In one episode, she said she had grown up believing that love had to be earned, that affection came with conditions and performance. She talked about the pressure of perfection, the fear of not measuring up, the pain of being dismissed as dramatic whenever she shared her needs. She didn't say my name. She didn't have to. The stories followed a familiar rhythm, a misunderstanding, a correction, a moment where she felt judged. These weren't lies exactly, they were distortions, bent truths, real events taken out of their context and left to fester in the open air. She told one story about a dinner party when I had suggested that the risotto was a little undercooked. I remember the moment clearly. I had smiled when I said it. It wasn't a judgment. It was a gentle nudge. That night she described it as a moment that echoed a lifetime of never being good enough. I didn't know feedback could become trauma. I didn't know mild honesty could be turned into a wound worth publishing. What caught me off guard wasn't the exaggeration. It was the production quality. The show had music, sponsor segments. She had built something profitable out of personal pain, and I had unknowingly become the fuel. There were ads for organic teas, sustainable jewelry, online therapy services. Real businesses were paying her to tell a story where I played the antagonist. I checked the show's social media. Comments flooded in. Hundreds of women thanking Fallon for putting their feelings into words. One wrote that the way Fallon described the silent resentment of an older woman who never said thank you mirrored her own childhood. Another said she had stopped talking to her own mother-in-law after listening to the second episode. They believed her. They didn't just hear her voice. They trusted it. I clicked on Ellis's profile. He had shared the link to the show a week earlier with a caption that read, "Proud of my wife for speaking her truth." No mention of me. No acknowledgement that he knew the episodes would sting. Just blind encouragement. That moment hit differently. I had raised him to notice things, to think for himself. But here he was, standing behind a narrative that erased nuance, that turned our family history into a monologue. I remembered something Warren used to say: truth without context is a weapon. I hadn't understood what he meant until now. The podcast wasn't an outlet. It was a product, carefully curated, market-tested. Fallon had taken her talent for performance and merged it with the trend of trauma as currency, and she had sold it well. What remained then was the question that started growing in my chest. Not anger, not even shame, just a cold, steady awareness that I had been participating in this without realizing it. I had given and stayed quiet, funded and stepped back. I had left space for Fallon to define things, and she had taken that space and made a stage. I closed the laptop, stood in the middle of the kitchen, and looked around. Nothing in the room had changed, but I had. Something invisible had shifted. I no longer recognized the version of myself she had drawn, but I could finally see the shape of the woman I had become. The woman who had spent years not wanting to take up space. The woman who was no longer willing to be edited out. That Friday morning, I stood in front of my bedroom closet with a manila folder in one hand and the phone in the other. The folder was labeled Home, but the contents inside didn't resemble anything like it. I had just reviewed the property documents for Ellis and Fallon's house. The deed, still partly in my name. The automatic payments, drawn monthly from my trust account. The numbers stared back at me like a quiet accusation. I called Ellis. He answered on the third ring, casual as ever, his voice cheerful in that distracted way he had when he wasn't really listening. I asked him if he had a minute to talk. He said sure. I waited for him to ask how I was, but he didn't. I told him I had been reviewing my finances and wanted to revisit the house arrangement. There was a pause, a small one, but it landed heavy. He said if something was wrong, they could look at refinancing, but it would take time. Fallon had cut back her hours to focus on the podcast, and his job had been up and down since spring. He said they appreciated everything I'd done and hoped I understood that it wasn't easy for young families right now. I didn't say much in response. Just told him I needed to evaluate things. He said he understood, but I could hear the discomfort in his tone. It was the same tone he used as a teenager when he knew he had pushed too far. After we hung up, I sat in the den and stared at the shelves. Family photos, graduations, vacations. A black and white photo of Warren holding Ellis on his shoulders, both of them laughing at something out of frame. That was the version of family I still carried, the version that now felt like a painting hung in the wrong museum. I turned to my laptop and opened a new tab. I logged into my business accounts. I had kept 2 properties under my name as rental units. David, a friend of Ellis's, had been doing the landscaping on them for the past 5 years. I checked the invoices. The rates were high, above market. I had approved them without much thought back then. I looked at the names on the contracts, the business license, the address, all connected back to Ellis's consulting work. It wasn't direct income for him, but it kept the wheels turning. I realized then how deep the web went. My money wasn't just supporting their house, it was floating their entire way of living. Then came the part that turned my stomach. I pulled up Fallon's name in my QuickBooks system. I had referred her bookkeeping services to 3 small businesses I used to mentor. I paid her a monthly retainer to handle their paperwork. One of them, a small flower shop downtown, had emailed me last month about delayed reports. I had shrugged it off at the time. Fallon had been receiving $1,200 a month for maybe 6 hours of work, sometimes less. I shut the computer. The air in the room felt too still. Not hot, just close. I stood up and opened a window. The breeze that came in felt like the first real breath I'd taken in days. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about clarity. The more I looked, the more I saw that I hadn't just been supporting them financially. I had become the scaffolding of their entire lifestyle. And not once had they stopped to ask if I was all right, holding it all up. I picked up the manila folder again and pressed it flat on the desk. The glass had cracked, not from a sudden blow, but from years of quiet pressure. And now, finally, I was ready to let it break. By the time Sunday arrived, I had made a list. Not a mental list, not a theoretical one, but a full page, handwritten with a steady hand. At the top, I wrote a title in ink: What I Give, What They Take. Below it, I drew 2 columns. I filled them in slowly, without emotion. Facts, numbers, arrangements, habits. I had spent decades thinking boundaries were rude, that pulling away was cold, that family meant adjusting, absorbing, enduring. I never saw how many little cuts I had accepted, one by one, until they bled into something I could no longer hide. After breakfast, I walked down the hall to the home office I once used for consulting work. It still smelled like dry paper and printer ink. On the far shelf sat a row of business cards I had saved from years ago, when I mentored other women in leadership. One card stood out: Margaret Chen, estate attorney. I picked it up and called the number without hesitation. She remembered me, said she still had my file in her cabinet. When I told her I wanted to schedule a meeting, she asked if this was about retirement. I told her, not exactly. We set a time for Tuesday morning. I hung up, then opened my laptop again. The next 3 hours were a series of small, deliberate steps. I drafted emails to the 3 businesses Fallon had been working with. I told them I would no longer be managing referrals and suggested they begin the process of finding replacements. I phrased it neutrally. No blame, just business. Then I called David, the landscaper who'd been billing me well above standard rates. I told him I was reviewing vendor contracts and would be collecting competitive bids starting next month. His voice dropped. He asked if something had happened. I said only that things were changing, that I was simplifying. He offered to lower his rates. I thanked him, but said I needed to explore other options. For the first time in a long while, I heard hesitation in his silence. It felt strange, how easy it was once I started. I had imagined that pulling away would feel like tearing something vital, but it didn't. It felt like releasing breath I didn't know I'd been holding. The last email I wrote was to my accountant. I asked him to begin outlining what the process would look like if I sold my share in the company. The firm had been running without my daily input for over a year. I had stayed on mostly out of habit and a fear of leaving things unfinished. But suddenly, the idea of letting go didn't scare me anymore. That evening, I sat by the window with a glass of water and watched the light fade across the yard. The hydrangeas had started to turn, blue giving way to muted purple, then cream. I remembered planting them with Warren. We had dug into that soil together, arguing over spacing and sunlight. He always said they'd be prettier if I let them grow wild. I insisted on symmetry. In the fading light, they looked exactly as he would have liked. A little unruly, a little free. I had always thought strength looked like staying, holding things together, absorbing shocks. But maybe it didn't. Maybe strength was knowing when to stop, when to step back and let things stand or fall on their own. The silence in the house no longer felt suffocating. It felt clear, like space had finally opened up for me to move, not toward anyone, not for anyone, just forward, just away from what no longer deserved my silence. Tuesday morning came with a light drizzle, and the kind of grey sky that made everything look softer. I drove to Margaret's office with the windows cracked just enough to feel the dampness in the air. Downtown was still waking up, and traffic was light. I parked in the same lot I used to use when I met clients years ago. Everything looked familiar, but I no longer felt like I belonged to it. Margaret greeted me at the door with a firm handshake. She was calm, composed, and didn't ask too many questions right away. We sat across from each other in her glass-walled office, the city behind her blurred by the rain. She asked what I had in mind. I told her I wanted to start the process of separating my business holdings from my personal support systems. I told her I wanted to understand what it would mean legally and financially to let go of the company entirely, and more importantly, what steps I needed to take to make that happen without warning Ellis or Fallon. She didn't flinch, just nodded and took notes. Margaret was efficient, but not cold. She told me it would take a few months to structure the sale quietly, that we could build in protective clauses, prepare for contingencies, that it was entirely possible to move forward without alerting anyone until everything was finalized. I told her that was exactly what I needed. When the meeting ended, I stepped out into the mist and stood by my car for a moment. My coat was damp by the time I slid into the driver's seat, but I didn't mind. There was something cleansing about the way the fog wrapped around the city. I drove home in silence. That afternoon, I opened the guest room closet. It had been years since anyone used that space for staying overnight. The shelves were still stacked with things from the past. Extra linens, a few boxes of Ellis's college trophies, some framed photos I had taken down but never thrown away. I cleared half the shelf and began gathering the documents Margaret had asked for. Financial records, business contracts, deeds, account ledgers. I created a neat, labeled stack and placed them into a portable file box. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. No phone calls, no explanations. I moved like someone rearranging furniture in the middle of the night, careful not to wake anyone who had long since stopped listening anyway. By Thursday, I had rewritten my will. The new version removed Ellis entirely as a beneficiary. The trust for Layla, my granddaughter, remained, but with strict clauses ensuring the money would only be accessible when she turned 18. There would be no more middlemen, no more channels for guilt to pass through. On Friday, I contacted a realtor who specialized in lake properties. I asked her to send me listings for modest homes near the water. Nothing grand. Just enough space for myself and a small garden. She asked if I was planning a retirement move. I told her I was planning a transition. That weekend, I sat outside on the back porch, watching the wind move through the oak trees. The leaves had started to loosen, small movements signaling the shift in seasons. I didn't feel angry anymore. What had replaced the anger was something deeper, a kind of clarity, like finding yourself in a room you didn't realize you had locked yourself into years ago, and finally remembering where you left the key. I wasn't making a scene. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was untangling, quietly, deliberately, leaving behind the invisible threads that had kept me tied to an idea of family that no longer fit. Every form I signed, every folder I packed, every decision I made behind closed doors. They were not acts of spite, they were acts of reclamation, and by the time the first leaf touched the ground, I knew I was almost ready. Not to run, not to fight, just to walk out the door and close it behind me. The call came late in the afternoon, just as I was finishing up a list of last-minute notes for Margaret. I almost let it go to voicemail, but the number caught my eye. It was from the office line of the buyer's due diligence team. I picked up, expecting a simple confirmation about next week's meeting. Instead, I heard a man's voice I didn't recognize. He introduced himself as James Morrison, part of the acquisition review process. Then he said something that made my heart stop. He thanked me for the earlier phone conversation with my assistant, who had given him permission to proceed with the preliminary information request. I don't have an assistant. I asked him to clarify who he spoke to. He said she answered my home phone earlier that day, said she was organizing files for me, and sounded very professional. I told him firmly to stop all communication until further notice and direct everything through Margaret from now on. I ended the call and stood perfectly still in the kitchen. There was only one person who had a spare key to my house. I called the landline. It rang 4 times before I heard her voice. Calm, casual, as if she had every right to be there. Fallon said she thought I was at an appointment, claimed she had come to water the plants. I told her I didn't have any that needed watering. Then she said she was looking for some of Ellis's tax documents. I asked her why she answered my phone. She said it rang 3 times and she thought it might be important. Her voice changed halfway through that excuse. She knew I knew. I told her I was on my way. The drive felt longer than usual. My hands stayed tight on the wheel. I didn't listen to music. I didn't let my thoughts get ahead of me. I stayed in the moment, the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful, just focused. When I pulled into the driveway, Fallon's car was still there. I stepped inside through the front door and found her in my office, sitting at my desk, papers spread out like they belonged to her. She didn't look up right away. When she finally did, I saw it on her face. Not guilt, just a flicker of irritation that she had been caught early. I asked her if she found what she was looking for. She straightened a stack of papers and said she was confused, that she thought I was getting rid of the business, and she just wanted to see what was happening. She kept her tone light, almost condescending, the way she talked when she believed she still had the upper hand. I told her those were private documents, that what I did with my business was not hers to know or manage. She pushed the papers toward me and said this affected all of us, that David relied on those contracts, that she depended on my referrals, that Ellis's income was tied to my holdings. Her voice shook a little, not from emotion, but from losing control. I stood across from her and asked the question I had held back for years. Was I still her mother-in-law? Or had I just become a structure she leaned on to avoid building her own? She didn't answer. She gathered her things in silence, avoided my eyes, and left the room without a word. The front door closed behind her with a click, so quiet it felt rehearsed. I walked back into my office and looked at the papers she had handled. Everything was still there, still in order, but it felt like the last layer of something had been stripped away. Fallon didn't come back that night. She didn't call, and neither did Ellis. The next morning, I woke up with a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in months. Not because things were resolved, they weren't, but because now the lines were clear. She had crossed into something she couldn't explain away, and I had finally closed the door she thought would always stay unlocked. By the time Monday arrived, the final purchase agreement had landed in my inbox. Margaret sent it over with a short note, outlining the last few items for review. It was all there: the valuation, the transition timeline, the non-disclosure terms, no room for ambiguity, no space left for delay. I printed the pages one by one and laid them out across the kitchen table. It felt right, signing them in the same place where I had once written checks for college tuition, business bailouts, and emergency expenses that were never called what they really were. Now it was different. This was no longer giving. This was ending. When I signed the final page, I didn't feel triumphant. There was no music in my head, no imagined applause, just the quiet, steady beat of my pulse. It wasn't joy. It wasn't grief either. It was something in between, a kind of sobering peace. Later that afternoon, Margaret called to confirm the documents had been received. She said everything would move forward on schedule. The sale would close in 6 weeks. I asked if I needed to do anything else. She said no. The rest would happen on its own. That same evening, Ellis showed up at my door. He didn't call first. He just pulled into the driveway, stepped out of the car like it was any other visit, and rang the bell with that same casual rhythm I used to find comforting. I opened the door and waited. He didn't smile. He stepped inside and stood in the hallway like a man unsure whether he belonged in the house he grew up in. His eyes scanned the room, then settled on me. He asked if it was true, about the business, about the contracts, about the money. I told him it was. He let out a breath, the kind people release when they've run out of things to deny. He said Fallon was upset, that things were tight, that the timing couldn't be worse. He said it like I hadn't already lived through every version of their emergencies. He said the business was a part of the family, that what I did, would ripple out. I didn't argue, I didn't explain. I only told him that it was no longer my responsibility to carry their plans on my shoulders. He stared at me for a long time. Then he said something I hadn't expected. He said they felt blindsided. I nodded. I said I had felt that way too. He left 10 minutes later. No raised voices, no doors slammed. But when he walked down the porch steps, I knew something irreversible had shifted between us. Something that couldn't be patched with explanations or softened with time. Over the next few days, the calls came like clockwork. Fallon called once, then again, then again. Each time her messages grew more frantic. She said the vendors were pulling back, that the flower shop had found a new bookkeeper, that David was losing clients. She said I was being cruel. She said I was acting out of spite. But I didn't return the calls. I had returned enough. On Thursday, the realtor emailed with a list of available cottages along the northern edge of Lake Willoughby. I clicked through the photos. One had a small wraparound porch and a view of the water through tall pines. It reminded me of the way Warren used to sketch lake houses on napkins, back when it was still a maybe someday dream. I replied with a simple sentence. I'd like to see this one in person. Then I stood in the hallway, looked around the house that had held decades of effort, and felt no panic, no hesitation, only the clarity that sometimes comes after a storm passes and you realize the roof held just fine, but you no longer want to live underneath it. Fallon's last voicemail arrived late that night. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. Her voice was small, worn thin, like someone who had finally run out of lines to play. She said she didn't understand how I could be so calm while tearing everything apart. But I hadn't torn anything. I had simply stopped holding it together. 3 weeks after the sale closed, I moved into the small cottage overlooking Lake Willoughby. It sat at the edge of a narrow gravel road, tucked between 2 old maples and a slope of wild grass. The house wasn't new. The porch needed paint. The screen door creaked. But it was mine. Not inherited, not borrowed, not attached to anyone else's decisions. Just mine. I arrived on a Tuesday morning with 2 suitcases, a box of framed photos, and 1 file folder containing documents I might still need. Everything else had been packed away, donated, or left behind. The movers came later with the rest, but by then I had already walked the perimeter twice and found the spots where the afternoon light settled best. The air here was different, quieter, even in the wind. I could hear birds clearly. No traffic, No voices coming from the walls next door, just trees and lake and air. The first thing I did was hang a wind chime Warren had given me our last Christmas together. I found it in the back of a drawer, still wrapped in tissue. I stood on the porch, hooked it to the corner post, and listened to the soft notes when the breeze came. He would have liked this place. He always wanted somewhere with a view, not for the beauty, but for the stillness, for the space it created inside you. Inside, the cottage was simple: one bedroom, one bathroom, a narrow kitchen that opened into a sitting area. There was a wood stove in the corner, and the windows were old but clean. The previous owners had left behind some furniture, worn but sturdy. I kept most of it. I didn't need new things. I needed space to be new in. That first night, I slept with the window cracked. The breeze carried in the smell of pine and something damp and earthy I couldn't name. I didn't dream. I didn't wake in the dark, checking my phone or wondering what I'd forgotten to do. I slept the way children sleep when no one expects anything from them in the morning. The days that followed moved slowly, the way I had always wanted time to move. I found a small bakery in town that sold fresh bread on Thursdays, and a grocery that knew the names of its customers. I walked every morning down to the shoreline and watched the sun move across the lake. I didn't think of Ellis. I didn't wonder what Fallon was doing. I didn't look at my phone unless it rang, and it rarely did. One afternoon, I sat with a notepad and wrote out a new version of my will, not for legal purposes, just for myself. I wrote a letter to Layla to be opened on her 18th birthday. I told her about her grandfather, about the smell of rain on old wood, about what it feels like to finally choose your own life. I told her the trust was hers, but that she owed me nothing, not visits, not explanations, just the promise that she would pay attention to her own voice before letting someone else rewrite it. When I folded the letter and sealed it in an envelope, I placed it in the drawer beside my bed. Then I poured myself a glass of water, stepped out onto the porch, and listened to the lake. Not for meaning, not for clarity, just to hear it breathe. I had spent years filling silence with responsibility. Now I let silence speak for itself. The envelope arrived on a Thursday. No return address. Just my name written in a hand I hadn't seen in years. It was careful, not hurried. A kind of writing that came from someone who had rewritten the words many times before choosing the version they could live with. I sat with it unopened for an hour, not because I was afraid of what it would say, but because I no longer felt rushed to hear what others needed from me. Eventually, I opened it. The first line read, "I've been trying to write this for months." The letter was from Fallon. She wrote that David's business had collapsed completely, that the podcast lost its sponsors, that Ellis had returned to part-time consulting. She said the house felt too big now, quiet in the wrong ways. She admitted she had spent years chasing approval, even when she didn't understand who she was trying to please. She didn't ask for money, or a second chance. She didn't try to explain everything away. Instead, she wrote, "I finally understand why you walked away. You weren't punishing us. You were freeing yourself." She said she was sorry for telling a version of the truth that left me voiceless. She said she kept the bracelet, not because it meant anything good, but because it reminded her of the moment she realized something had broken. She ended the letter by saying she hoped I had found what she never could name: peace, something not borrowed or earned, just chosen. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer next to Layla's envelope. I didn't write back, not because I was angry, not anymore, but because some messages are complete the moment they arrive. Outside, the lake moved gently, the surface broken only by wind and time. I stood on the porch, one hand resting on the railing, and let the silence stay with me. I didn't need closure. I had chosen my ending long before the letter came. I was 70 years old, and I was finally living a life that didn't require anyone else's permission. If you've ever reached a point in life where you had to choose peace over obligation, you're not alone. Let me know where you're listening from, or what part of this story stayed with you. And if you're carrying too much for too long, maybe today is the day you set something down. Thank you for being here.